The rain arrived with the Duke of Ashworth, as though the heavens themselves mourned his return to the ancestral seat he had abandoned for the better part of 4 months. Ashworth Manor rose from the Derbyshire landscape like a monument to faded glory, its grey stone walls darker still beneath the weight of autumn's dying breath, its countless windows reflecting nothing but the leaden sky and the skeletal branches of gardens left to wither in deliberate neglect. Adrian Ashworth descended from his carriage with the practiced indifference of a man returning not to a home, but to an obligation, his boots striking the gravel drive with sharp, impatient sounds that scattered the gathering crows from their perches along the western wing. The air tasted of coming winter and regret, though he would not have named the latter, would not have acknowledged that tightness in his chest as anything more than distaste for the damp and the cold. 2 years had passed since his father's debts had shackled him to this place in ways that went beyond mere inheritance. 2 years since he had stood in the chapel and spoken vows to a woman whose name he could barely bring himself to utter, whose face he had scarcely troubled himself to examine on that grey morning when duty demanded he marry the merchant's daughter with her vulgar dowry and her common blood. Eleanor Ashworth, she was called now, though he never used the title, never granted her the dignity of duchess, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. She had been the price of his freedom from his father's gambling debts, the transaction that kept Ashworth Manor from passing into the hands of creditors, and he had paid it with all the grace of a man signing away a piece of his soul. He had left her here, installed her in the East Wing like an artifact too valuable to discard but too shameful to display, and had departed for London within a week of their wedding, returning only when estate business or social obligation demanded his presence. The manor loomed before him now as his butler emerged to greet him, and Adrian felt nothing but the familiar hollowness that had become his constant companion, the sense that he had traded one prison for another and gained nothing but a wife he did not want and could not respect. He moved through the entrance hall with its fading tapestries and portraits of worthier ancestors, barely noticing the servants who bowed and curtsied in his wake, his mind already calculating how soon he might return to London and the life that felt more real than anything these ancient walls contained. It was only as he passed the long gallery that something caught his eye, a movement in the window that overlooked the dying rose garden, a figure in pale blue standing among the thorns and the rain-soaked earth, and for the briefest moment, Adrian Ashworth saw his wife, really saw her, for perhaps the first time since their wedding day, a slender silhouette against the grey autumn sky, and something he could not name stirred in the hollow space behind his ribs before he turned away and continued toward his study, dismissing the vision as he had dismissed everything about Eleanor for 2 long years. Adrian had rehearsed his justifications so many times in the 2 years since his wedding that they had taken on the quality of sacred truth, immutable facts that required no examination and permitted no doubt. Eleanor Pemberton, as she had been before she purchased her way into the Ashworth name with her father's merchant fortune, represented everything his breeding had taught him to disdain: new money earned through trade rather than inherited through generations of noble blood, manners learned from tutors rather than absorbed from birth, a lineage that could be traced back perhaps 2 generations before dissolving into the unremarkable masses of common England. She had been the solution to a problem, nothing more, the key that unlocked the debts his father's weakness had accumulated, and Adrian had turned that key with all the enthusiasm of a man opening his own prison cell. He had avoided her with an artistry born of genuine aversion, timing his arrivals and departures from Ashworth Manor to minimize any possibility of encounter, taking his meals in his study when forced to remain in residence, instructing the household staff to keep the East Wing entirely separate from his own apartments in the western quarters, where his father and grandfather had resided before him. He told himself she had everything she could reasonably desire: a roof over her head, food on her table, servants to attend her needs, and the protection of his name, even if he could not bring himself to offer the dignity of his title. What more could a merchant's daughter expect from a duke who had married her only to save his ancestral home from ruin? He had never presented her to society as his duchess, had attended balls and dinners alone, had allowed his acquaintances to assume his wife remained in the country due to delicate health or personal preference, and when his mother wrote letters inquiring after the Pemberton girl, he responded with terse assurances that she was adequately housed and caused him no trouble. It was on the 3rd day of his current residence at the manor that Adrian encountered Eleanor in the hallway, connecting the main gallery to the library, a chance meeting that neither could avoid without obvious rudeness, and he found himself stopping mid-stride as she did the same, both of them frozen in that awkward ballet of people who share a name but not a life. She curtsied, a small, precise movement that seemed to contain neither resentment nor expectation, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement, his eyes skating across her features without truly seeing them, noting only that she seemed somehow diminished since their wedding day, smaller and quieter, as though she had been fading gradually in the shadows of the east wing like a portrait left too long in the Sunday, Your Grace, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, and he managed a curt, "Madam," before continuing past her, but not before he caught the scent of lavender and something else, something like rain-washed earth, and the entirely unwelcome observation that her gown, though simple and undoubtedly years old, was immaculately maintained and suited her fair coloring in a way he had never troubled himself to notice before. The first crack in Adrian's carefully constructed indifference appeared 3 days into his residence, manifesting not as a dramatic revelation, but as a chance observation that left him standing motionless in the corridor outside the blue drawing room. His hand arrested midway to the door handle as voices drifted through the partially open doorway. They were servants' voices, unmistakably so, but speaking with a warmth and affection that seemed entirely foreign to the stiff formality he had always associated with household staff, and the words that reached his ears made him pause in confusion because they were speaking of Her Grace with something that sounded remarkably like devotion. He had rarely heard the servants mention Eleanor at all during his previous visits, and certainly never with this tone of genuine regard, and the strangeness of it held him there, listening like a common eavesdropper until footsteps approaching from the opposite direction forced him to abandon his position and continue down the hallway, the puzzle of those affectionate voices lingering in his mind like an irritant he could not dislodge. It was later that same afternoon, as Adrian made his way toward the library seeking refuge in correspondence that required his attention, that he witnessed the incident that would fundamentally disturb his assumptions about the woman he had married and abandoned. A young scullery maid came rushing around the corner from the servants' stairs, her face blotched with tears and her apron askew, moving with such heedless speed that she crashed directly into Eleanor, who had been walking in the opposite direction with her characteristic quiet grace. Adrian stopped in the shadows of a doorway, expecting to witness the sort of sharp reprimand that would be entirely appropriate for such carelessness, perhaps even dismissal given the severity of the collision, but instead he watched in mounting astonishment as Eleanor steadied the girl with gentle hands and spoke in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear the words. The maid was sobbing now, apologizing profusely between gasping breaths, and Eleanor guided her to a nearby bench with all the care one might show to an injured child, sitting beside her and taking the girl's work-roughened hands in her own without the slightest hesitation or disgust. The story emerged in fragments. The maid's mother had fallen ill in the village. There was no money for a physician. The fever was worsening, and the girl was terrified she would lose the only family she had left. Eleanor listened with an attention that seemed to encompass the maid's entire being, and when the tale was finished, she did not offer empty platitudes or dismissive comfort, but instead rose with immediate purpose and instructed the girl to return to her duties while Eleanor herself would attend to the matter. Within minutes, Adrian watched from his concealed position as Eleanor dispatched a footman to fetch Dr. Morrison from the village, sent another servant to the still room for medicines, she specified with surprising precision, and wrote out instructions for food and supplies to be delivered to the sick woman's cottage, all accomplished with an efficiency that suggested this was far from the first time she had orchestrated such assistance. The maid departed with tears of gratitude rather than distress, and Eleanor stood alone in the hallway for a moment afterward, her hand pressed briefly to her heart, as though steadying herself before she continued on her way with that same quiet dignity Adrian had noted in their hallway encounter, leaving him standing in the shadows wondering if what he had just witnessed was an aberration or a revelation, and whether the woman he had dismissed as insignificant might be something he had never troubled himself to discover. The days that followed Adrian's observation of Eleanor's compassion toward the scullery maid passed with a peculiar quality of heightened awareness, as though some faculty of perception that had lain dormant within him had suddenly awakened and now insisted on cataloguing details he had previously dismissed as beneath his notice. He found himself lingering in doorways and corridors where he might observe the household staff going about their duties, and what he witnessed troubled the foundations of assumptions he had maintained without examination for the entirety of his adult life. The servants moved through Ashworth Manor with a contentment that seemed entirely at odds with the rigid, joyless efficiency he remembered from his childhood and had always accepted as the natural state of a well-run household. Mrs. Bramwell, the head housekeeper who had served the Ashworth family for 3 decades and whose face Adrian could not recall ever arranging itself into an expression of pleasure, actually smiled as she directed the upstairs maids in their work, and the smile transformed her severe features into something approaching warmth. The footmen no longer moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers at drill, but instead carried themselves with a dignity that suggested they took genuine pride in their service rather than merely enduring it out of necessity. Adrian found himself seeking out his butler, Mr. Hendricks, under the pretense of discussing household accounts and staffing matters, questions he had never before troubled himself to ask directly, and though Hendricks responded with the impeccably neutral deference that his position required, Adrian detected something beneath the surface of those careful answers, a respect that seemed to be directed not toward himself, but toward someone else entirely. When Adrian inquired about the general state of the household, Hendricks replied that the manor had never been better managed, nor the staff more satisfied with their circumstances, and when pressed to elaborate, the butler allowed that Her Grace took a personal interest in the welfare of every member of the household, a statement delivered with such carefully controlled admiration that it spoke volumes about sentiments the man would never directly express. Adrian wandered through sections of the manor he rarely visited, and discovered fresh flowers arranged in the servants' quarters, not the wilted cast-offs from the formal rooms, but vibrant blooms, clearly chosen and placed with care. And passing by the kitchens at an unusual hour, he heard the cook and her assistants singing while they worked, their voices blending in a folk melody that spoke of contentment rather than mere tolerance of labor. The realization settled over him with the weight of an accusation he could not refute. The entire atmosphere of Ashworth Manor had transformed during his prolonged absences. It shifted from the cold formality he had always known into something warmer and more vital. And the architect of this transformation was the woman he had relegated to the shadows of the East Wing and dismissed from his consideration. Adrian made a decision that night, as he sat alone in his study with a glass of brandy growing warm in his hand, a decision that both intrigued and unsettled him in equal measure. He would remain at the manor rather than fleeing to London, as had been his habit, and he would observe more carefully this stranger, who wore his name and had apparently accomplished what he never could, turning a house into something that resembled a home. Adrian's decision to remain at Ashworth Manor rather than fleeing to the familiar diversions of London society meant that he was present on a Tuesday morning when he happened to pass by one of the unused drawing rooms in the East Wing, a room he had always associated with dusty furniture covered in Holland cloth and windows that admitted only grudging light through their coating of grime, but which now seemed transformed by sounds that drew him inexorably toward the partially open door. The voices of children reached his ears first, high and bright with excitement, and then Eleanor's voice responding to them with a patience that seemed infinite as she guided them through what appeared to be a lesson in reading. Adrian positioned himself where he could observe through the gap in the doorway without being seen, and what he witnessed made him feel as though he were watching a scene from some other household entirely, some place where warmth and kindness were the natural order rather than the exception. Eleanor sat in a circle with perhaps 8 or 9 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12, all of them dressed in the simple clothing of servants' families, and she held a book open in her lap while the children took turns reading passages aloud with varying degrees of proficiency. Her patience with their struggles was remarkable, the way she would gently correct pronunciation without ever making a child feel ashamed of their mistakes, the way she praised each small success with genuine delight that made the children's faces glow with pride. When one small boy stumbled over a particularly difficult word and looked ready to cry from frustration, Eleanor set the book aside and told them all a story instead, something about a clever fox and a vain peacock that had the children laughing with such uninhibited joy that Adrian felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest. The smallest girl, who could not have been more than 6 years old, climbed into Eleanor's lap with the unself-conscious trust of a child who has never known rejection, and Eleanor wrapped her arms around the child and continued the story while stroking the girl's hair with absent tenderness. When the tale concluded and the children clamored for another, one of the older boys declared with the absolute conviction of childhood that the Duchess is the kindest lady in all of England, and the others immediately agreed with enthusiastic certainty, and Adrian watched his wife's face soften with an emotion he could not name, but which made her seem suddenly, devastatingly beautiful. This did not match his perception of her at all. This woman who commanded children's love and created beauty from neglected spaces, and Adrian found himself assailed by a memory he had successfully suppressed for 2 years, their wedding day, when he had stood beside her before the altar and never once looked at her face, never asked what she wanted or feared or hoped for, treating her as nothing more than a transaction that settled his father's debts and secured the Ashworth estates. The guilt that stirred in him then was small but insistent, like the first crack in a dam that presages the flood to come. The conversation with Mr. Whitmore, the estate steward, occurred 3 days after Adrian had witnessed Eleanor teaching the servants' children, and it began as a routine review of household expenditures, but transformed into something that shook the very foundations of Adrian's understanding of the woman who bore his name. Whitmore spread the account ledgers across the desk in Adrian's study with the meticulous care of a man who took pride in accurate record-keeping, and as they reviewed the various entries, Adrian noticed an unusual pattern in the allocations that seemed to have begun approximately 18 months prior, shortly after he had departed for an extended stay in London following one of his rare, uncomfortable visits home. When he inquired about the significant expenses labeled simply as household improvements, Whitmore's weathered face arranged itself into an expression of barely concealed admiration as he explained that Her Grace had undertaken a comprehensive program to improve the living and working conditions of the manor's staff, all funded entirely from her own dowry settlement rather than the estate accounts. The specifics that Whitmore enumerated struck Adrian with the force of accusations he could not refute. New uniforms for all the servants, properly fitted and made of quality fabric rather than the threadbare cast-offs that had been standard. Substantial improvements to the staff quarters, including proper heating and repairs that had been neglected for years. Enhanced provisions for the kitchens so that the servants ate as well as their masters. Arrangements with physicians in the village to provide medical care for the household staff and their families without charge. The establishment of a lending library stocked with books carefully selected to suit various reading levels and interests, and perhaps most remarkably, the creation of an emergency fund that servants could access without shame when illness or misfortune struck their families, all administered with such discretion that the recipients need never feel they were accepting charity. Adrian sat in stunned silence as Whitmore continued, noting that Her Grace had never once requested funds for personal expenditure during the entire period of her residence at Ashworth Manor, had never asked for new gowns beyond the minimum required for propriety, had expressed no interest in jewels or carriages or any of the luxuries that women of her position typically demanded as their due, and had instead directed every penny of her personal income toward the welfare of others. The steward's voice carried a quiet reproach as he observed that the Duchess possessed a remarkable facility for accounts and estate management, far superior to what one might expect from her background, and that she had transformed the household from a place where servants worked merely to survive into something approaching a true community where people took pride in their labor and genuinely cared for one another's well-being. Adrian dismissed Whitmore with words he barely registered speaking, and when he was alone again in the study that suddenly felt suffocating in its masculine severity, he found himself confronted by a memory that burned with shame. Himself at a London dinner party 6 months after his marriage, listening to some earl make a joke about merchants' daughters buying their way into noble houses, and Adrian had actually laughed and made some cutting remark about common blood that had earned appreciative chuckles from the assembled company, and he understood now with devastating clarity that Eleanor possessed more true nobility in her smallest gesture than he had demonstrated in his entire privileged, wasteful life. The afternoon sun had emerged from behind the perpetual grey clouds that seemed to brood over Ashworth Manor, and Adrian found himself drawn by some impulse he could not name toward the East Gardens, those neglected acres that had once been his mother's pride, but which had fallen into picturesque ruin after her departure, overgrown with ivy and brambles that swallowed the old stone paths and classical statuary until the whole resembled some romantic painting of melancholy decay. What he discovered there arrested him completely, for Eleanor knelt in the dirt among a group of gardeners, her hands working soil alongside theirs with no consciousness of her station, her simple day dress already stained with earth, and her hair escaping from its pins to fall in dark tendrils around her face as she directed the planting of what appeared to be an extensive herb garden, laid out with surprising precision and design. She was explaining something about the medicinal properties of various plants to old Thomas, the head gardener who had served the estate for 40 years, and Adrian was astonished to hear the depth of her knowledge as she discussed the cultivation of feverfew for headaches, the proper harvesting of chamomile, the uses of comfrey for healing wounds, speaking with the confidence of someone who had studied these matters seriously rather than as a genteel accomplishment. Thomas listened with obvious respect, occasionally asking questions that Eleanor answered with patient thoroughness, and Adrian found himself moving closer despite his intention to observe from a distance, his boots crunching on the gravel path and announcing his presence to the small group of workers who immediately began to rise and bow. Eleanor looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read, wariness mixed with something else, and perhaps surprise that he had ventured into this part of the grounds that he had so clearly ceded to her domain, and she rose gracefully, despite the dirt on her hands and the disarray of her appearance, meeting his gaze with a directness that was neither defiant nor submissive, but simply honest. He found himself asking about her work here, actually asking rather than commanding or dismissing, and her voice, when she responded, carried a soft quality that somehow also conveyed absolute confidence, as she explained her plan to create a medicinal garden that would supply the village with remedies for common ailments, reducing their dependence on expensive physicians for minor complaints, while teaching the local women to recognize and use healing herbs themselves. She did not grovel or seek his approval in her explanation, did not perform the elaborate deference he had always assumed was his due, but instead spoke to him as one reasonable person to another, describing her careful research into which plants would thrive in their soil and climate, her correspondence with an apothecary in London who had advised her on cultivation techniques, her vision for sharing this knowledge with those who needed it most. Adrian realized with a jolt of recognition that in 2 years of marriage he had never actually spoken to her, had only ever spoken at her during their few necessary interactions, issuing instructions or making dismissive comments, but never engaging in genuine conversation, never asking her thoughts or listening to her words as though they mattered. Standing there in the garden with the afternoon light, catching the auburn highlights in her hair and illuminating the intelligence in her eyes, he saw her properly for the first time, not as the merchant's daughter who had purchased her way into his title, not as the shameful necessity he had tried to hide, but as a woman of remarkable capability and quiet strength who had taken the cold neglect he had offered her and transformed it into something beautiful and useful for others. That night Adrian could not sleep, could not even pretend to rest, and he found himself pacing the length of his chambers like some caged animal confronting the bars of its own making, his mind churning with memories that arrived with the relentless precision of an executioner's blade, each one a small death of the man he had believed himself to be. He remembered the wedding with excruciating clarity now, how he had stood beside Eleanor at the altar and spoken his vows while looking somewhere past her left shoulder, refusing to meet her eyes, as though direct acknowledgement might somehow make the humiliation more complete, and he recalled how small her voice had been when she spoke her own promises, barely audible in the vast cathedral that his family had built to celebrate their ancient lineage. That lineage he had considered himself to be sullying by accepting her father's money in exchange for a title the merchant could never otherwise claim. The wedding night returned to him with particular shame, how he had escorted Eleanor to the Duchess's chambers that had been prepared for her, had made some cold pronouncement about her comfort being adequately provided for, and had then retreated to his study, where he spent the hours until dawn drinking brandy and nursing his wounded pride, while she waited alone in rooms she had never seen before, in a house full of strangers who served a husband who would not even grant her the basic courtesy of his presence. For 2 years he had treated her as though she were invisible, introducing her on the rare occasions when necessity demanded it as "my wife," but never as the Duchess of Ashworth. That subtle distinction that signaled to all of society that she was to be tolerated but not truly accepted, acknowledged but not honored, and he saw now with devastating clarity how deliberately cruel that choice had been. The society events paraded through his memory in an unbroken stream of evidence against him. The autumn ball, where he had danced with half a dozen eligible young ladies while Eleanor remained at Ashworth Manor, the opera where he had occupied the family box with his mother and unmarried sister while making excuses about Eleanor's delicate health, the shooting party at Lord Pemberton's estate, where he had accepted the invitation for himself alone, without even considering that a wife might accompany her husband to such gatherings, and always, the careful explanations he gave when anyone inquired, the dismissive references to her common background, the jokes he made at her expense that earned appreciative laughter from those who valued bloodlines above humanity. His mother's letters emerged from memory with particular venom, her delicate inquiries about the merchant's daughter, and whether Adrian found his circumstances tolerable, her suggestions that he might establish Eleanor somewhere in the country where she would not be an embarrassment, her transparent hope that the marriage might prove childless, and thus end with Eleanor's eventual death without permanently contaminating the family line, and Adrian understood with sickening recognition that he had echoed every one of his mother's prejudices, had made them his own truth, and had used them to justify treating his wife as something shameful, to be hidden rather than honored. Eleanor had never complained during those 2 long years, had never written to him during his extended absences demanding his attention or his affection, had never appeared at his door in London, insisting on her rights as his duchess, had never done anything except exist quietly in the space he had allocated to her, while he lived his life as though she were merely some uncomfortable obligation he had discharged and could now forget, and he realized now that her silence had not been acceptance, but rather the quiet dignity of someone who refused to beg for what should have been freely given. She had simply taken the cold neglect he offered and transformed it into something luminous and good, had become in truth what he had only ever been by accident of birth, had earned through her actions the nobility that he possessed only as an inherited title, and standing alone in his chambers, with the first light of dawn beginning to show beyond his windows, Adrian understood that he had been given a gift he did not deserve, and had spent 2 years crushing it beneath the weight of his own unfounded superiority. The following morning, Adrian appeared in the small breakfast room where Eleanor took her meals, a space he had never before entered during their 2 years of marriage, and the surprise that crossed her face when he greeted her and asked if he might join her was so complete that it pierced him with fresh shame, for clearly she had grown so accustomed to his absence that his presence now seemed an intrusion into the separate life she had built within the walls of his own house. He attempted conversation, asking after her plans for the day, inquiring about the progress of the medicinal garden, making what he hoped were thoughtful comments about the work he had witnessed, but his words emerged stilted and formal, as though he were speaking to a stranger at some tedious social obligation, rather than to the woman who bore his name and lived under his roof. Eleanor responded with perfect courtesy, her answers complete enough to avoid rudeness, but brief enough to discourage further exchange, and he could see in the careful neutrality of her expression that she had erected defenses against him, walls built stone by stone during the long months of his neglect, fortifications that would not be breached by a few awkward pleasantries over toast and tea. She told him about her plans to expand the children's school, mentioned in passing that she had corresponded with a botanist in Edinburgh about certain rare herbs, noted that the village women had expressed interest in learning more about medicinal preparations, but she volunteered nothing beyond the bare facts of her activities, offering no glimpse into her thoughts or feelings about this work that so clearly consumed her passion and energy. Adrian found himself growing frustrated with the very barrier he had constructed, wanting to demand that she speak to him with the warmth and animation he had witnessed when she addressed the gardeners or taught the children, yet understanding with bitter clarity that he had forfeited any right to such intimacy through his own deliberate cruelty. Days passed in this uncomfortable pattern, Adrian seeking Eleanor's company with increasing frequency while she remained politely distant, answering his questions but never asking any of her own, never inquiring about his business in London or his plans for the estate, never showing the slightest curiosity about his life or his thoughts, and he realized with a shock of recognition that she had learned not to care about him, and had trained herself out of whatever natural interest a wife might take in her husband's affairs, because he had made abundantly clear that her interest was unwelcome and her opinions worthless. She never asked him for anything, never requested his presence at some event she had planned, or his opinion on some decision she faced, never sought his approval for the projects she undertook, or his assistance with the challenges she encountered, and he understood that this independence, which might in another context have seemed admirable, was in truth the saddest testament to his failure. For Eleanor had built a complete life at Ashworth Manor that simply did not include him, except as a distant landlord whose permission she had learned she did not need. He was a stranger in his own home, walking corridors that Eleanor had filled with purpose and warmth, passing servants who looked to her for guidance and protection, observing the transformation she had wrought in every corner of the estate, while remaining himself utterly peripheral to it all, and the knowledge that she had made the manor into a true home for everyone except him settled over his heart, like winter frost over dying flowers. The illness arrived in the village like some malevolent fog rolling in from the marshlands, first claiming old Thomas the blacksmith's youngest grandchild, then spreading through 3 cottages on the eastern edge of the settlement before anyone understood the danger they faced, and by the time word reached Ashworth Manor, the fever had taken hold of nearly 24 souls, with more falling sick by the hour. Adrian learned of it from his steward during their morning meeting, the man's worried report barely finished, before Eleanor appeared in the doorway of the study without knocking, her face pale but composed, already dressed in her plainest gown, with her hair pulled back severely, as though she were preparing for battle rather than social calls, and she spoke with a quiet authority that brooked no discussion about needing the carriage immediately, about mobilizing the household's medical supplies, about sending riders to fetch physicians from the neighboring estates and the apothecary from the market town. Adrian watched her transform before his eyes into something formidable and fierce. This woman he had dismissed as meek and insignificant, now issuing commands with the precision of a general marshalling troops, and within the hour she had organized a small army of servants, loading wagons with blankets and medicines and food, had dispatched messengers in 4 directions with requests for assistance, had converted the largest wagon into a mobile sick room, stocked with everything she deemed necessary for treating the afflicted. It was only when she climbed into the driver's seat of that wagon herself, taking up the reins with hands that showed she knew well how to manage a team, that Adrian found his voice and his authority, stepping forward to forbid her in tones that had made hardened soldiers quail during his brief military service, telling her that she would absolutely not expose herself to such danger, that he would send servants to provide whatever care was needed, but she would remain safely at the manor. Eleanor looked down at him from her perch on the wagon seat, and in her eyes he saw something he had never witnessed there before, a core of absolute steel beneath the gentleness, a strength that made his commands seem like the petulant demands of a child trying to assert control he had long since forfeited. And when she spoke, her voice was soft as always, but carried the weight of irrefutable truth. "These people are my responsibility, Your Grace, mine in ways you have never understood or acknowledged, and I am Duchess of Ashworth whether you have chosen to recognize it or not." The words struck him like physical blows, each one a reminder of his failure, and before he could formulate a response, she had set the horses in motion, the wagon rolling down the drive, while he stood watching in impotent fury that was really fear, terrible consuming fear that he might lose her to this illness before he had any chance to make amends for the years he had wasted. And without conscious decision, he found himself calling for his own horse, following the dust cloud of her wagon toward the village, while his mind conjured every nightmare scenario of Eleanor lying fever-sick and dying while he stood helpless beside her, understanding at last with devastating clarity that somewhere in these past weeks of awkward conversation and careful observation, he had begun to care whether she lived or died, had begun to see her not as an obligation or an embarrassment, but as someone precious and irreplaceable, and the possibility of losing her now filled him with a panic he had never known even in battle. The sick house that had been hastily established in the village assembly hall smelled of fever and fear, and the sharp medicinal herbs Eleanor had brought in her wagon, and Adrian found himself following her through that dim space, as though she were a general and he merely a foot soldier awaiting orders, watching as she moved from pallet to pallet with a calm efficiency that revealed both extensive knowledge and genuine compassion for the suffering souls who reached for her hands with desperate gratitude. She did not flinch from the hardest tasks, the most unpleasant necessities of caring for the desperately ill, bathing fevered bodies and cleaning soiled linens and holding basins for those too weak to manage alone, and Adrian found himself doing the same under her quiet direction, in his own hands performing services he would once have considered beneath his dignity, while Eleanor showed him through her actions that true nobility lay not in rank, but in willingness to serve those who had no power to repay the kindness. The villagers called for her constantly, their voices weak but filled with something approaching worship, and he heard an old woman whose gnarled hands clutched Eleanor's sleeve whisper, "Our angel," with such fervent belief that he understood these people had long ago given Eleanor the honor and respect he had withheld, and recognized in her what his prejudice had blinded him to seeing. Hours blurred together in that makeshift hospital, marked only by the rhythm of Eleanor's instructions as she taught him to prepare her herbal remedies, to recognize the signs of crisis in a fever patient, to offer water in small, careful sips to those too weak to drink on their own. And in the strange intimacy of shared purpose, Adrian discovered a connection to his wife he had never imagined possible, their hands working in concert to ease suffering and preserve life. There came a moment when they both reached for the same bottle of medicine, their fingers touching in the dim lamplight, and both froze in sudden awareness of each other, not as duke and merchant's daughter, not as disappointed husband and neglected wife, but simply as two people laboring together toward a common good. And in Eleanor's eyes, he saw a flicker of something softer than the steel that had commanded him to stay away, perhaps a tentative recognition that he was trying to be better than he had been. The barrier between them seemed to thin in that endless night of tending the sick, each small collaboration building upon the last, until they moved together with an almost practiced ease, Adrian anticipating what Eleanor would need before she asked, Eleanor trusting him with tasks that required both skill and compassion. And when dawn finally broke over the village and Eleanor declared that the worst of the crisis had passed, that no more had died during the night, and several showed signs of recovering, they rode back to the manor together in exhausted silence that felt less like estrangement and more like the comfortable quiet of soldiers who had survived battle side by side, both too weary for words, but bound together by what they had shared in ways that awkward breakfast conversations could never have achieved. They sat in the drawing room as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, neither having changed from their soiled clothes or washed the stains of the sick house from their hands, too exhausted to observe the proprieties that had governed their separate existences for 2 years, and in that raw, vulnerable moment, when fatigue had stripped away all pretense and armor, Adrian found words spilling from his mouth that he had never intended to speak, an apology that began as careful phrases but broke apart into something far more honest and desperate as he tried to articulate the shame that had been building in him for weeks. He told her he was sorry, inadequate words that could never encompass the magnitude of his cruelty, and as he spoke, Eleanor's carefully controlled composure began to crack, tears sliding down her cheeks, leaving tracks through the dust that had settled on her face during their long night of labor. And she wept silently at first, before the sobs broke free with a force that seemed to come from some deep well of stored grief. "I thought I could earn your respect," she whispered when she could speak again, her voice raw with pain that made Adrian's chest constrict with the knowledge that he had caused this suffering. "I thought if I proved myself worthy enough, if I was kind enough and useful enough and quiet enough, you might finally see me as something other than the shameful bargain you were forced to make." Adrian felt each word like a knife finding its mark in his heart, understanding with devastating clarity that while he had been nursing his wounded pride and aristocratic prejudices, Eleanor had been fighting a lonely battle to prove her value to a man who had never given her the slightest reason to hope for acceptance, and his attempts to explain his behavior sounded hollow even to his own ears, excuses about duty and expectations and the weight of his family's judgment that could never justify the casual cruelty with which he had treated her. Eleanor's dignity remained even in her hurt, that core of strength he had witnessed in the village showing through as she straightened her shoulders and met his eyes directly. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a truth that cut deeper than any recrimination could have. "You never gave me a chance to be anything but shameful to you, Adrian. From the moment we spoke our vows, you decided I was beneath you, and nothing I did could change that verdict, because you never actually looked at who I was." He realized this was the conversation they should have had 2 years ago. The honest reckoning between two people bound together by circumstance, but kept apart by pride and prejudice, and he found himself telling her things he had never admitted, even to himself, confessing how his father's debts had felt like a personal failure, how marrying a merchant's daughter had seemed like the final proof of the Ashworth family's decline, how he had blamed her for the position he found himself in when the fault was entirely his own and his father's before him. Eleanor listened with tears still flowing but her gaze steady, and Adrian saw in her face both the woman he had dismissed and the duchess she had become, despite his rejection. Understanding that she had created meaning and purpose in a life he had tried to make meaningless, had found ways to serve and give and love when he had offered her nothing but cold indifference, and the realization of how much he had missed, how much richness he had sacrificed on the altar of his own stubborn pride, filled him with a grief that matched her own. The weeks that followed their dawn conversation moved with the slow, tentative rhythm of spring awakening after a long winter, and Adrian found himself asking Eleanor each morning if he might join her in whatever work she had planned for the day, his requests carrying a humility that was entirely new to him, as he waited for her permission to enter the world she had built in his absence, learning through patient observation about everything she had created while he had been deliberately blind to her efforts. He discovered that her intelligence was formidable, her knowledge of estate management more thorough than his own, despite her merchant background. Or perhaps because of it, for she understood accounts and resources and the practical needs of those who worked the land in ways his aristocratic education had never taught him, and her wit emerged gradually as her guardedness slowly eased, small flashes of humor that caught him by surprise and made him realize how much richness he had denied himself by refusing to know her. Their meals together became genuine conversation rather than awkward silence. Eleanor sharing her thoughts about the village school she hoped to expand, the improvements she envisioned for the tenant farms, her dreams of creating a place where those without other opportunities might find purpose and dignity, and Adrian contributed his own observations and resources while marveling at how her mind worked, always thinking of others, always seeking ways to lift up those who had less fortune than she possessed. They took walks together through the gardens she was restoring, Eleanor explaining her plans for the overgrown spaces with an animation that lit her face in ways he had never seen, and he found himself remembering small details she mentioned, simply for the pleasure of seeing her surprise, when he referenced them days later, brought her books on medicinal herbs he had ordered from London. He's noticed when she seemed tired and suggested she rest, small gestures that felt inadequate against the weight of his past neglect, but represented his earnest attempt to show through actions what his words could not quite convey. Eleanor responded to these overtures with cautious warmth, sharing more of herself with each passing day but never quite abandoning the protective reserve that his years of coldness had taught her to maintain, and Adrian understood that he was earning back her trust, one careful moment at a time, rebuilding what he had never properly built in the first place. The household watched their tentative courtship with poorly concealed delight. Mrs. Bramwell's knowing smiles following them through the corridors, the servants finding excuses to linger when the Duke and Duchess were together as though witnessing something precious and long-awaited, and Adrian realized that these people who had loved Eleanor from the beginning were now hoping he might prove worthy of the treasure they had recognized when he had been too proud to see, and their approval, something he found himself desperately wanting to earn. Hope was growing between them like the spring bulbs Eleanor had planted in the East Garden, small green shoots pushing through cold earth toward warmth and light, fragile still but persistent, and though Adrian knew the full flowering of what might exist between them was far from certain, he tended these first signs of life with the devotion of a man who understood he had been given a chance at something rare and irreplaceable, something he would spend whatever time remained to him proving he deserved. Adrian made his announcement over breakfast one morning in early summer, when the gardens Eleanor had restored were beginning to bloom in earnest. His declaration that he intended to host a ball at Ashworth Manor, landing between them with the weight of something momentous, and he watched Eleanor's face carefully as he explained that she would be presented to society properly, formally, as the Duchess of Ashworth in the way she should have been 2 years earlier, when their marriage had been a shameful secret he kept hidden from his peers. Fear flickered across her features before she could mask it, that old uncertainty rising in her eyes as she asked quietly whether he was certain this was wise, whether exposing her to the scrutiny of the ton might not bring him more embarrassment than honor. And Adrian felt his heart contract at the realization that she still saw herself through the lens of his old prejudices, still believed on some level that she was the shameful bargain he had once named her. He reached across the table to take her hand, a gesture that still felt new enough to make them both acutely aware of the contact, and told her with a fierceness that surprised them both that he was determined to honor her publicly and to claim her before all of society as his duchess and his wife, to correct the grievous wrong he had done her by hiding her away as though she were something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. The preparations began immediately, Adrian insisting that Eleanor have new gowns made by the finest modiste in London, that the ballroom be restored to its former glory, that every detail reflect the importance of the occasion, and he watched Eleanor move through these arrangements with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that made him wish he could shield her from the judgment he knew awaited, while simultaneously understanding that this trial by society was necessary for her to truly claim her place as Duchess of Ashworth. His mother arrived 3 days before the ball, her carriage rolling up to the manor with the same imperious authority she had always wielded, and Adrian steeled himself for the confrontation he knew was coming, as the Dowager Duchess swept into the drawing-room with her familiar expression of aristocratic disdain already firmly in place. She wasted no time in expressing her disapproval of the entire venture, her words dripping with contempt as she demanded to know why Adrian was suddenly parading his merchant bride before society, after having had the good sense to keep her hidden for 2 years, and something in Adrian snapped at hearing Eleanor described in those terms. His defense of his wife emerging with a force that shocked his mother into silence as he told her that Eleanor was worth 10 of any woman she had ever pushed at him, that she possessed more true nobility in her smallest gesture than most of the ton could claim in their entire pedigrees, that he would not tolerate anyone, not even his own mother, speaking of her with anything less than the utmost respect. The dowager stared at her son as though seeing a stranger, her shock visible in the way her mouth opened and closed without sound, and neither of them noticed Eleanor standing in the doorway where she had come upon this scene. Her hand pressed to her heart as she listened to Adrian defend her with a passion that told her more clearly than any private words could have that his transformation was real and complete and unshakable, that he had truly chosen her over the prejudices of his class and the expectations of his family. And in that moment, something in her that had remained guarded and uncertain finally began to believe that the hope growing between them might actually be allowed to bloom. Eleanor descended the grand staircase on the evening of the ball like something from a dream Adrian had never dared to have, her gown of emerald silk catching the candlelight and transforming her into a vision that stole the breath from his lungs as he stood at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for her. And he realized with a shock of recognition that he had never truly seen his wife before this moment, had never allowed himself to notice the graceful line of her neck, the quiet elegance in how she carried herself, the way her dark hair had been arranged to reveal the delicate bones of her face that he had been too blind and too prejudiced to appreciate. She paused halfway down the stairs, her hand trembling slightly on the banister, and their eyes met across the distance with an intensity that spoke of all the weeks of tentative rebuilding between them, all the hope and fear and fragile trust they had been nurturing, like gardeners tending precious seedlings, and Adrian extended his hand to her as she reached the bottom step, tucking her fingers into the crook of his arm with a possessiveness that was entirely new, as he told her in a voice rough with emotion that she was breathtaking and that she had always been beautiful, and he had been a fool not to see it. He led her into the ballroom with his head held high and his chest swelling with pride that felt both foreign and entirely right. Feeling the weight of society's collective gaze fall upon them as they entered together, the whispers starting immediately like wind through dry leaves, as the assembled nobility took in the sight of the Duke of Ashworth with the wife he had hidden away for 2 years, their eyes sharp with curiosity and judgment, and barely concealed contempt. Adrian raised his hand for silence, his voice carrying across the ballroom with an authority that came not from his title but from absolute conviction as he made his formal introduction, proclaiming Eleanor as his wife and the Duchess of Ashworth, in words that left no room for doubt or qualification, and he watched the faces of his peers as they processed this public acknowledgement of a woman most had assumed would remain a shameful secret forever. Their first dance together was a revelation of physical closeness after years of careful distance. Adrian's hand at Eleanor's waist, feeling the warmth of her through the silk as they moved through the waltz, their bodies finding a rhythm together that seemed to echo the tentative harmony they had been building in their daily lives, and he leaned close to whisper compliments that made color rise in her cheeks and told her that every man in the room envied him, that she moved with more grace than any woman he had ever partnered. Eleanor's responses were shy but genuine, her earlier fear giving way to something that looked almost like happiness as she allowed herself to believe in this moment, in his public claim of her, in the possibility that she might truly belong in this world that had seemed determined to reject her. And Adrian felt his heart clench with tenderness at her courage in facing this trial for his sake. The evening progressed with its share of thinly veiled contempt from certain quarters, Lord Pemberton making a comment about merchants' daughters playing at nobility that carried clearly across the refreshment table, and Adrian's response was immediate and devastating, his public rebuke delivered in a tone of ice, as he informed Pemberton that his wife possessed more true nobility in her smallest finger than Pemberton had in his entire overfed body, that anyone who could not show her the respect she deserved would no longer be welcome at Ashworth Manor or considered a friend of his. The silence that followed his words was absolute and electric, society watching with bated breath as the Duke of Ashworth chose his merchant bride over the approval of his class, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this public demonstration of his loyalty, even as she maintained her composure with the quiet dignity that had always been hers. Some guests began to thaw as the evening continued, drawn despite themselves by Eleanor's genuine warmth and the obvious transformation in Adrian, and he watched with satisfaction as his wife's grace and intelligence slowly won over those with eyes clear enough to see past prejudice to the remarkable woman he had been blessed to marry. Above in the servants' gallery, Mrs. Bramwell and the household staff watched their Duchess shine with tears of pride streaming down their faces, their joy at seeing her finally honored in the way she deserved more precious to Adrian than any approval from the ton, and he looked up once during the evening to catch Mrs. Bramwell's eye, receiving a nod of acknowledgement that told him he had finally begun to earn the respect of those who had loved Eleanor when he had been too proud to see her worth. And this moment of public declaration, healing something in both Eleanor and himself that had been broken by years of shame and hiding, transforming their marriage from secret burden into celebrated partnership before all the world. The last guests departed near midnight, but Eleanor found herself too restless to retire despite the exhaustion that weighted her limbs and the evening's intensity, leaving her nerves humming with an energy that would not permit sleep, and she slipped out through the terrace doors into the garden, where roses bloomed silver in the moonlight, and the air hung heavy with their perfume and the promise of summer storms. She had not expected to find Adrian there among the climbing vines, his coat discarded and his cravat loosened in a way that made him look younger and more uncertain than the commanding Duke, who had defended her so fiercely before all of society, and they both froze when their eyes met across the garden path. This chance meeting in the darkness feeling somehow more significant than all the careful conversations they had shared in daylight. Adrian spoke first, his voice rough as he confessed that he could not sleep, that the evening had unsettled something in him that he needed to name before another day passed in half-truths and careful politeness. And Eleanor felt her heart begin to race as he crossed the distance between them, with steps that spoke of determination hard won. He told her then, standing among the roses she had planted with her own hands, that he was falling in love with his own wife, that he had been falling for weeks now without fully admitting it to himself, that watching her tonight had made him realize he wanted not just her forgiveness, but her heart, her trust, and her love, if she could ever bring herself to give it to a man who had squandered 2 years of the gift he had been given. Eleanor's guarded heart trembled at the edges, wanting desperately to believe but terrified of the pain that would come if he changed his mind again, if this transformation proved temporary or conditional, and she asked him in a voice that shook with vulnerability how she could trust this, how she could believe he would not wake one morning and regret her all over again, and regret the merchant's daughter who had bought her way into his life. Adrian's response was a vow delivered with such fierce conviction that it bypassed her rational defenses and struck directly at the hope she had been trying so hard not to nurture, his promise that he would spend every day of his remaining life proving himself worthy of her, that he would never again make her doubt her place at his side, that he had been given a grace he did not deserve, and he would not waste it. The kiss, when it came, was tentative and tender and transformative. Years of distance and hurt and loneliness bridged in the press of his lips against hers, in the way his hands framed her face as though she were something precious and breakable. In the salt taste of tears on both their faces, as they stood in the garden at midnight and allowed themselves finally to heal, the walls between them crumbling like ancient fortifications no longer needed, because the war was over and they stood on the same side at last. Two people who had been strangers choosing to become partners, choosing vulnerability over safety, choosing love over pride, and the roses bloomed around them in silent witness to this quiet revolution of the heart. The months that followed their midnight confession in the rose garden brought a transformation to Ashworth Manor that seemed to touch every stone and beam with light. As Adrian and Eleanor built their partnership not on the unstable ground of duty or obligation, but on the solid foundation of genuine affection and shared purpose, their days filled with the quiet contentment of two people discovering that love could be both gentle and profound when nurtured with patience and honesty. Adrian joined Eleanor in her charitable work with an enthusiasm that surprised even himself, accompanying her on visits to the village where he learned the names of families he had never bothered to know, sitting with her as she taught the servants' children their letters, and finding that he had a gift for making them laugh with stories from his own boyhood that he had thought long forgotten, his presence at her side lending the authority of his title to her compassion and making their combined efforts twice as effective as either could have achieved alone. Society's acceptance of Eleanor came slowly but steadily, aided by Adrian's unwavering advocacy and the undeniable evidence that the Duchess of Ashworth possessed both grace and intelligence that transcended questions of birth, and gradually invitations began to arrive addressed to both of them. Dinner parties where Eleanor's thoughtful conversation and genuine interest in others won over even the most skeptical of the ton's matrons, and musicals where Adrian's obvious pride in his wife made other husbands examine their own marriages and find them wanting by comparison. Their growing intimacy unfolded in layers both emotional and physical. Late-night conversations in the library, revealing dreams and fears they had kept hidden even from themselves, Adrian learning that Eleanor had always loved astronomy and arranging for a telescope to be installed in the East Tower, Eleanor discovering that her husband wrote poetry he had never shown anyone, and carefully copying his best verses into a leather-bound journal she gave him for his birthday, their bodies finding each other with increasing confidence in stolen kisses and lingering touches that promised more than they had yet dared to claim fully. The manor itself seemed to respond to their happiness, laughter echoing through halls that had known only cold formality during Adrian's father's time, the drawing room becoming a place of warmth where they sat together in the evenings reading aloud or simply talking while the fire crackled and rain pattered against the windows, the breakfast room transformed from a place of awkward silence into a sanctuary where they shared their plans for the day over tea and toast and the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed words to communicate their contentment. The servants watched this transformation with a joy that manifested in 1,000 small ways. Mrs. Bramwell humming as she went about her duties, Mr. Hendricks permitting himself actual smiles when he observed his master and mistress walking together in the garden, the kitchen staff competing to create Eleanor's favorite dishes, and noting with satisfaction how Adrian now noticed and thanked them personally for their efforts, and the entire household basking in the reflected glow of a marriage that had been rescued from the brink of permanent estrangement and remade into something that gave them all hope, that broken things could be mended if only people had the courage to try. Adrian found himself learning from Eleanor's compassion in ways that humbled and changed him, her patient explanations of why certain reforms mattered, teaching him to see the humanity in people he had previously dismissed as mere servants or tenants. Her gentle corrections when his old prejudices surfaced, making him examine beliefs he had absorbed without question from his upbringing, and discard those that could not withstand the light of her wisdom, and he marveled that he had been given the extraordinary gift of a wife who made him want to become a better man, not through criticism, but through the simple example of her own goodness. Eleanor, in turn, gained confidence from Adrian's steady love and public support, her natural warmth and intelligence flowering now that she no longer had to guard every word and gesture against potential rejection, and she began to allow herself to believe that the transformation she witnessed in him was real and permanent, that she could trust in this new foundation. They were building together brick by brick through accumulated moments of tenderness and shared purpose. The manor that had been her prison becoming at last the sanctuary she had always dreamed it might be, filled with laughter and love, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine when they had stood as strangers at an altar 2 years before. The autumn afternoon brought unexpected visitors to Ashworth Manor in the form of 3 men from Adrian's past, dissolute acquaintances from his university days who arrived without invitation in a cloud of cigar smoke and presumption, their presence immediately disrupting the peace that had settled over the household like an ill wind disturbing still waters, and Adrian felt the old life reaching for him with grasping fingers as Lord Wetherby, Sir Marcus Thorne, and the Honourable Julian Pembroke swept into his study with the casual arrogance of men who had never learned that their welcome might expire. They spoke of Eleanor within minutes, their crude comments about the merchant's daughter delivered with nudges and knowing smirks, assumptions woven through every word that Adrian of course shared their views, that his marriage was merely a financial transaction he endured with appropriate disdain, their laughter ringing hollow in a room that had become sacred to him through hours spent there with his wife, discussing estate matters and charitable projects. And Adrian felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love. Wetherby made a particularly vulgar jest about the advantages of wives who knew their place and expected nothing beyond their keep, his words slurring slightly from the brandy he had consumed before noon, and Adrian found himself standing abruptly, his voice cutting through their laughter with a coldness that made all 3 men fall silent in surprise at the transformation they witnessed in their old companion. He told them in words that left no room for misunderstanding that Eleanor was the finest person he had ever known, that her compassion and intelligence exceeded anything their collective nobility of birth had produced, that he would not tolerate her name, spoken with anything less than the utmost respect under his roof or anywhere else, their paths might cross. His rejection of their assumptions absolute and unequivocal, and the stunned silence that followed his declaration, stretched taut as a bowstring, before Thorne recovered enough to laugh uncertainly and suggest that marriage had made Adrian soft. What Adrian did not know was that Eleanor had returned early from the village and now stood in the hallway outside the study door, her hand pressed to her mouth as she listened to her husband defend her with a ferocity that finally shattered the last fragments of doubt that had lingered in the corners of her heart, despite all the tenderness of recent months. This public choice between his old life and their new one, laying bare the depth of his transformation in a way that private words never could. The confrontation escalated as Pembroke suggested that Adrian was throwing away good fellowship for a woman who would never truly belong in their world, his tone pitying in a way that made Adrian's hands clench at his sides, and when he ordered them to leave his home immediately, choosing Eleanor over companions he had known since boyhood, without a moment's hesitation. Their departure was marked by disgust and disbelief, doors slamming and horses' hooves clattering on the drive as they fled back to London to spread tales of how thoroughly the Duke of Ashworth had been domesticated by his common wife. Eleanor entered the study as soon as they were gone, crossing the space between them without a word, and Adrian turned to find her there with tears streaming down her face and something luminous and trusting shining in her eyes that made his breath catch. Her complete trust finally given without reservation or guardedness, and when she reached for him, he gathered her close and felt the final wall between them dissolve like morning mist beneath the sun, 2 people who had been strangers becoming at last the partners they were always meant to be. And that night, when he carried her to the bedchamber they had never truly shared, their marriage was consummated, not in duty or obligation, but in love, freely given and gratefully received, the physical union sealing an emotional bond that had been forged through patience and courage and the willingness to become better than they had been. And Eleanor fell asleep in her husband's arms, knowing with absolute certainty that she was cherished, valued, loved beyond measure. The merchant's daughter, who had become a duchess, finding that she had gained something far more precious than a title she had gained, a true partner who would stand beside her against the world's judgment and choose her every time, without hesitation or regret. 2 years passed like pages turning in a beloved book, and spring arrived at Ashworth Manor with a gentleness that seemed to bless every blossom and blade of grass, the estate flourishing under Eleanor and Adrian's joint stewardship in ways that transformed not only the physical property, but the very souls of all who lived and worked there. The village thriving with new cottages built to replace crumbling hovels, a proper school established where the children learned trades alongside their letters, and a lending system that allowed families to improve their circumstances without the crushing weight of usurious debt that had plagued them for generations. Eleanor moved through the manor's sun-filled rooms with the serene grace of a woman utterly secure in her place and purpose, her condition evident now in the gentle swell of her body that carried their first child, a daughter they would name Catherine after Eleanor's mother, and Adrian watched his wife with a wonder that had not diminished but rather deepened with time, marveling that he had been granted the extraordinary privilege of sharing his life with someone whose goodness made him want to be worthy of her every single day. Society had come around gradually but thoroughly to respecting the Duchess of Ashworth, her intelligence and genuine compassion winning over even the most entrenched skeptics, and invitations now arrived regularly, requesting their presence or their patronage, other noble families quietly approaching Adrian to ask how he and Eleanor had managed to reform their estate's practices without sacrificing profits, discovering to their surprise that treating people with dignity and fairness actually improved productivity and loyalty in ways that cruelty and neglect never could. The manor itself had been transformed from the cold mausoleum of Adrian's childhood into a true home filled with light and laughter, every room touched by Eleanor's warmth and Adrian's growing capacity for joy, the servants no longer merely content but genuinely prosperous and loyal, their children educated and healthy, their families secure in the knowledge that the Duke and Duchess cared for their welfare as much as for the estate's bottom line, and this transformation radiated outward like ripples on a pond, touching neighboring properties and inspiring change in unexpected places. On a particularly beautiful April afternoon, Eleanor and Adrian hosted a garden party for the servants and their families, the grounds alive with children's laughter and the quiet satisfaction of adults who knew themselves valued. And Adrian stood watching his wife move among the guests with a grace that needed no title to make it noble, her hand resting unconsciously on her rounded belly as she listened with genuine interest to old Mrs. Hendricks describe her grandson's progress in the village school, and he felt gratitude wash over him so powerfully that his eyes burned with unshed tears at the recognition of how close he had come to destroying the best thing that had ever happened to him through his own pride and prejudice. Eleanor found him standing alone beneath the ancient oak tree and came to slip her hand into his, their fingers intertwining with the easy intimacy of two people who had learned each other's hearts through patience and dedication. And when he whispered that she had saved him from becoming the worst version of himself, she turned to meet his eyes and replied with the simple truth that had become the foundation of their partnership, telling him softly that they had saved each other, that love was not one person rescuing another, but two people choosing daily to build something beautiful together from the broken pieces of what might have been. And in her words, he heard the echo of every morning they had shared, every challenge they had faced as partners, every moment of tenderness that had accumulated like compound interest until they found themselves wealthy beyond measure in the currency that mattered most, standing together in the spring sunshine, surrounded by people whose lives they had touched, and knowing with absolute certainty that the shame and isolation of their beginning had been transformed into something precious and lasting, a love that had been tested and refined and found to be genuine gold. The merchant's daughter and the prejudiced duke becoming simply Eleanor and Adrian, two souls who had found their way home to each other at last. The nursery at Ashworth Manor glowed with late afternoon light filtering through white lace curtains that Eleanor had chosen herself, and in the cradle carved from ancient oak that had been in Adrian's family for generations lay their daughter Catherine, barely 3 weeks old, with wisps of dark hair and her mother's gentle eyes. While Eleanor sat in the rocking chair her husband had commissioned from the village woodworker, and Adrian knelt beside them both with one hand resting on the cradle's edge and the other covering his wife's where it lay in her lap, the three of them, forming a tableau of completeness that neither parent had ever imagined possible during those bleak early years of their marriage, when shame and pride had built walls that seemed insurmountable. Adrian looked at his daughter and saw the future stretching before her, a childhood filled with love and security, and parents who would teach her that true nobility had nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with how one treated the vulnerable and powerless. And when he lifted his gaze to Eleanor's face, he found her watching him with that soft expression that still made his breath catch even after years of earning her trust. The merchant's daughter, who had become the finest duchess England had ever known, not through birth, but through the content of her character. And he marveled at the journey they had traveled together, from strangers bound by financial necessity to soulmates who had chosen each other again and again through every test and trial. Eleanor reached to touch his cheek with gentle fingers, reading in his expression the wonder and gratitude that had become his constant companions, and she thought of the frightened young woman who had arrived at this manor 4 years ago, expecting nothing and finding even less. How she had made herself small and useful, hoping to earn some scrap of acknowledgement from the husband who could barely look at her, and how patient endurance and quiet dignity had somehow transformed not only Adrian but herself, teaching her that she had always possessed worth that needed no external validation, though having her husband's love and respect made the knowing sweeter than she could have imagined. They sat together in the peaceful nursery while Catherine slept, and the manor hummed with life around them. Servants going about their duties with contentment, born of fair treatment and genuine care, and the village beyond the estate, walls thriving in ways that sent ripples of change through the entire county, as other noble families began questioning their own practices and finding that compassion and profit were not mutually exclusive. And Adrian understood with crystalline clarity that this moment, this simple afternoon with his wife and daughter, represented everything he had almost destroyed through his own prejudice and pride. The shame that had once defined their marriage transformed into a pride so profound it threatened to overwhelm him with its intensity. Dear listener, consider this truth that Eleanor and Adrian learned through patience and pain, that nobility of character will always surpass nobility of birth, that the courage to change and grow is the mark of true strength, and that love earned through genuine transformation is worth infinitely more than love demanded by right or duty. In your own life, when you encounter those whom society has deemed lesser or shameful, look beyond the surface judgments to see the worth that exists in every human soul, and if you find yourself trapped in circumstances that seem unchangeable, remember that it is never too late to become the person you were meant to be, that patience and dignity in the face of rejection can plant seeds that bloom in unexpected seasons, and that the walls we build to protect our pride often become the prisons that prevent our happiness. May you find the courage to love truly and be loved in return. May you learn to value character over pedigree and compassion over tradition, and may you rest peacefully tonight, knowing that your worth is not determined by others' recognition, but by the kindness you bring into the world and the love you nurture in your own heart.